depending on which part of the world that you're joining us from. Welcome to the Stellenbosch Business Institute LeaderSHIFT. LeaderSHIFT is a series really of high-level, high-impactful conversations that we have with global leaders once a month so that we're able to forge a way and create a safe space for leaders to be able to come together and be able to discuss the very interesting and pertinent matters that concerns the way that they lead organizations, the way that they lead countries, governance, and the like. My name is Faith Mangope, and as always, it's such an honor and a privilege to be facilitating these conversations for you once a month. These are high impactful conversations, as I've mentioned, where we get to focus really on foresight. We assist leaders to be able to formulate communities so that indeed they are able to be catalysts for change, depending on where they are within the organization, and to be able to even have these moments where they get to just relax and ask questions and be human for a second and have a human-centric approach to leadership. Because as I always say, leaders are human first. And so the LeaderSHIFT series aims to do just that. We've got 45 minutes where we get to introduce you to our global leaders. We'll then be taking you through even their own journeys, be able to shed some insights from some of their success stories, some of their failures, some of their lessons learned, all in the hope of being able to equip leaders within the various global communities so that they're indeed able to make an actual impact, an effective change, a sustainable change that is. So without further ado, as we know that every single month here with the LeaderSHIFT series, courtesy of the Stellenbosch Business Institute, we introduce to you one such a leader. And today, I tell you, you're in for quite a treat. I'd probably say that every single month, but today you really are in for quite a treat, because today we're joined by John Davis. I'm going to tell you a little bit about John Davis. He's a professor of practice at the universities of Oregon's Lundquist College of Business and chair of the Brand New View. And of course, it's a leadership firm that helps organizations become a force of social and economic good. I tell you one thing, he's also got a book out as a titled, and we'll talk a little bit about it later on, Radical Business, How to Transform Your Organization in the Age of a Global Crisis. So it's going to be an impactful conversation. When I mean that you're in for a treat, you definitely are in for a treat. But without further ado, let me welcome John into this conversation. John, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the SBI, Stellenbosch Business Institute LeaderSHIFT. Such a pleasure to be with you. Tell us, first of all, where are you joining us from? Because the birdie told me that we are way behind. Well, we're ahead of you in terms of time, and where you are, it's quite early in the morning. So where are you joining us from?
So I'm joining from Oregon. By the way, Faith, thank you for having me. Great introduction there. And it was lovely to hear about the idea of business is actually all about people. So it's a good reminder of why this conversation and what we do for a living is critical. But yeah, I'm joining from Oregon, which is on the west coast of the US. And behind me is a mountain about an hour, 2 hours east of where I live. It's called Mount Bachelor. So it's just a favorite area to go out and recreate and do wonderful things in the outdoors, skiing. And as you can tell here, lovely lake just for hiking around. It's fantastic.
Absolutely fantastic. And also, I do know that you are also going to be going on an adventure very soon. I'm quite jealous, especially when it comes to the summer, because, you know, we are in the cold here in South Africa, so it's not very summery at all. But just talk a little bit about that journey. And you can also go into even your family, your background here, John, because I hear that you're heading to Europe. You're heading to where we all should be heading right now.
Yes, I am. I'm heading off to Italy. So my university, the University of Oregon, as you mentioned, has a campus in Siena, which is in Tuscany. And so I'll be teaching there this summer with a colleague in a program to help students focus on a couple different areas. Sustainability, which is what I'll be teaching, and he'll be teaching wine marketing. And the combination of those two things is designed to work with Italian wineries, get familiar with the industry there. It sounds like a tough job, doesn't it? And focus a bit about how wineries can become more sustainable, what some of the practices are in that space, but also more broadly speaking, just looking at the entire business landscape in Italy and exposing our students to that. It's interesting because when you go to different markets in different countries, you see very different practices, and that often has to do with the cultural DNA. So we're really excited about that. Plus, it's hard to argue against espresso, pasta, wine. Those are all really good things. So I'm excited about that. They'll be doing that for a couple of months this summer.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I'm quite envious, I must tell you, especially with the food part. You won me at the food. The pasta was what sold me to this one. But let's get into this. You know, you speak about sustainable businesses and how to build sustainability. And when you reflect on what has happened within the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of businesses felt as though the sustainability factor was challenged, because this is where a lot of businesses have had to pivot, a lot of businesses have had to review how they work, a lot of structural changes had to be made so that they can weather out the storm of a COVID-19 pandemic, which seemed to not dissipate anytime soon. I mean, we literally were thrown into the pool of the unknown and told to swim and to survive for as long as we could. And sustainability became a very challenging factor because people did not know how to sustain. Now, post-COVID, even though we still are within the COVID pandemic, but really post-COVID, and it's about post-COVID-19 recovery. How are we finding businesses managing, and how are we finding the sustainability conversation going on in businesses? I'm almost afraid that a lot of businesses are trying to survive as opposed to sustain. But from your experience and expertise, how are businesses having this conversation around sustainability?
Yeah, so COVID is a good intro into this, as you mentioned, for a couple of reasons, and I'll get right into the sustainability answer as well, but it ties into this. COVID was a big global wake-up call, and it was an effort to, well, unintentional effort, but it was an effort that resulted in how you can change behavior rather dramatically and drastically, given an existential threat. Sustainability, in effect, is a movement towards helping solve also an existential threat, and it deals with the climate crisis and things like social injustice, economic inequality. There's a broad umbrella under which sustainability falls. And COVID helped, I think, companies unintentionally, but I think it helped companies realize there are different ways that they can work, number one, and that is creating a more hybrid approach where people feel comfortable at work. That's useful. The second piece is, I think it helped create an ability and a mindset for people to be a bit more adaptable to what's going on in the world around them. And that is forcing some systemic change inside organizations where people are paying a lot more attention to these outside threats now. The third piece to that, and it precedes COVID, is that the sustainability movement, if you will, has been going on for quite some time. And in the business world, it's a bit behind, but now catching up. The science has obviously been real for a very long time. But the business world is now beginning to really pay real attention to this, and they're looking at it through a number of different lenses, which we can talk about today. But it deals with organizational change themselves. How do they transform themselves? It deals with the practical reality of how do they reduce in a real measurable sense their carbon impact. How do they create environments in which people feel like the ideas they have to help solve some of these challenges are ideas they can offer without retribution or fear of reprisal. And so I think COVID, by its own wicked ways, kind of opened up people's minds to being more flexible to how to solve some of these really challenging, huge issues, because these are huge issues, and sadly, they're existential, but we need to face it. And I think companies are really starting to do that. So it's good to see, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of work to be done, but in that working, how do businesses start taking the risks once again? I mean, in 2019, beginning of 2019, even close to the end of 2019, a lot of businesses were very open to risk taking and very open to, going into the VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty element of business, because they understood that there will always be almost a fail safe. They trusted in the future. But what COVID helped us understand is that the future is very fragile, and the future becomes very uncertain. And in that, a lot of the businesses stopped taking risks, stopped taking those plunges and the leaps that they used to encourage time and time again. How do we get that back again? Because it's very difficult if you've been operating from a systematic approach of self-preservation or organizational preservation to stop now wanting to branch out and say, maybe we need to go into the era of risk-taking once more for the purpose of expansion, growth, and the like.
Yeah, so you're right. This is a fragile time, and I'm going to come back to that issue of fragility in a moment. But the idea of businesses taking risks is an interesting continuum, right? Because you do have organizations, as you point out, that have had a really robust appetite around taking risks, innovating, whatever it might be. It typically is ascribed to the technology sector, but obviously it goes past that. But businesses writ large tend to be kind of risk averse. I mean, a lot of the way they're managed and operating is around ensuring they protect whatever gains they have gotten over the past several years. They want to ensure that financial integrity remains intact. They want to make sure their shareholders are happy. And so any decision that creates investment in something new is looked at with a fairly careful eye and scrutinizing eye, because you don't know what the outcomes might be. And so there is that element of risk adversity that comes into it. But it comes to something that you mentioned, which is this idea of sort of protecting what we've got here to ensure that we don't lose it. Yet at the same time, to the issue of fragility, it's really critical to realize that this is a existential threat. And when I start my classes with my MBA students, to give you an example, I often show a picture that was taken from the International Space Station, and it shows the curvature of the Earth. And in it, you can see this thin blue line on the exterior of the Earth. And of course, that's the atmosphere. And it's a lovely reminder that we are protected by a very thin layer of this atmosphere, that the outside that atmosphere, we are in the inhospitable domain of space. And so within the atmosphere, we obviously have beautiful places like behind me and where you live and where everybody on this podcast is. That has to be protected. And that's where businesses are realizing now that this existential threat and or risk adversity is really not a choice. We have to actually find ways to shift past the risk fear and toward how to help our businesses transform. And they're starting to take steps in that direction. Now, when I say they, it's a very sloppy way of looking at the business world, and it presumes by the use of that language that everybody's doing this, and they are not. We see it in fits and starts in different sectors where some are really embracing the idea of how to become more sustainable, but we see a lot that are still really reticent to make the change, partly because they're trying to protect shareholder interests in the way they've always done things, to try to ride it out as long as possible. And I think that's, those that do that are setting themselves up in a few years' time for, decline. But for those who embrace it now, that risk appetite is increasing, and they're looking for ways and solutions to try to solve it. So it really is a mix of things within that appetite. COVID certainly affected it, as you mentioned. But part of it is we're experiencing this stuff day in and day out, whether it's the extreme wildfires we're hearing about now and seeing, and the smoke here in North America coming from Canada, or the wildfires we suffered from a couple of years ago, to the fires in Australia, to the extreme drought conditions in certain parts of the world, the horrendous flooding in Pakistan in the last couple of years. All of these things are beacons of the change that's before us. And so we're experiencing this stuff. It's no longer abstract, and that's causing companies increasingly to wake up to what they can do to help be a part of the solution.
Yeah, and just before I move on with you, John, let me just also implore our delegates, if you do have a question, please won't you just put it on the chat box. We'll be able to just field some of those questions, because we want to keep this as interactive as possible. So let's make use, especially with the time that John has got. And we're going to go into the book a little bit right now. And you've mentioned some key nuggets as well about, transformation and how then do you start transforming and the like. So if you do have questions, please just put on the chat box. We'll be able to field those questions as this conversation continues. But in order for us to even have these plans of transformation, in order for us to have these plans of looking within the thin layer of being protected by the atmosphere, it requires a certain kind of leader, John. It requires a leader that is able to have foresight, and I often ask the question, who trains or who teaches the leader to lead ultimately? And where do we even learn this? Where do we even learn to navigate? Where do we learn to even have foresight? Just talk to us a little bit about the notion of leadership and the type of leaders that are needed in a crisis world.
Yeah, so the whole idea of sort of training leaders is an interesting concept by itself, because part of it is there's certainly learned knowledge through getting familiar with some basic principles. And then there's experience knowledge, which is really where the bulk, I think, of real leadership capability is developed. And the book came about because over the last couple of decades, and Faith, you may know this, from my background, but I lived overseas. I was in Singapore for 15 years. And that work in Singapore allowed me to travel the world and work with companies and leaders in over 40 countries. And that the culmination of all that experience kind of led to the book. And the reason why is because in those conversations with leaders, time and again, what kept coming up was actually something that was hopeful and optimistic to me, but also a stark reality. And that is, many of them recognize that as they particularly look back on their careers, that they wish they had done more to be more engaged in society, not just active socially, but actually helping be a part of whatever their local community is, and or being a better sort of societal citizen in the context of what the company's impact is in every market where they work. So many look back on that and said, I wish we'd done more of that. Now we're trying to set up leadership development systems that encourage that in our organizations. And at the same time, some of the other conversations were with leaders who are clearly in the throes of this right now. They're younger in their careers, they may be emerging leaders, and they have a voracious appetite for diving in directly and trying to solve these issues, not just from a larger corporate level, but even within a team. What can we do to be more responsible? All of those led to this sense of, okay, people are paying attention. It isn't just a greed-only, crass business commercial sort of mindset, but is actually a mindset that says business has a stake in society that is critical to ensuring that society progresses positively and can create a greater social good over time. And that means that business really does have to step in and find ways to kind of resolve these things. And that's where those leaders that you mentioned are having an increasing impact. And that was, first off, really a huge revelation, because I was going into a lot of the research with this sense that most leaders really didn't want to touch something like this because it's too against the ongoing operation of the business. But there are enough of them out there who are eager to try to tackle this. And that's what led to sort of the structure and the framework of the book, which we could talk about. But in it, I provide basically a blueprint to help companies figure out how to manage their way through the transformation process. And it isn't a blueprint of sort of make-believe. It is a blueprint based on tried and tested practices of other organizations that are distilled into the book. So that gave me such encouragement and real motivation around the role business can play and the leaders within businesses can play to really exact meaningful and measurable change.
Yeah, I want us to talk a little bit about the book, and I want us to deep dive a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the insights and the lessons and the research that's gone into it. And just for the purpose of the delegates, it's titled Radical Business: How to Transform Your Organization in the Age of Global Crisis. How to transform your organization in the age of global crisis. I mean, that should be a Bible. It should be ding, 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 ding. That should be actually a Bible. But let's talk about it and some of the insights. As you were curating the book, as you were going through the research, as you were trying to tap into some of these entrepreneurs. I mean, you've assisted entrepreneurs and businesses and startups from zero to about $1 billion worth of businesses, from like 0 to 1,000 staff members. That takes significant work, but that takes some serious foresight. That's a visionary who's able to do so. So some of the lessons learned and perhaps some of the learnings that we can get from the book.
Yeah, so the foresight point is a really important one. And if you had to boil down sort of an important trigger for any leader is the ability to have what we call signal detection, the ability to kind of scan the horizon being the larger world beyond their immediate confines of their business, to understand the ebb and flow of economic work, of the markets, of cultural changes, social changes and whatnot, but to be on top of what's going on. And the reason why that's important is you need to be able to cultivate sort of a mindset of perpetual curiosity. And that curiosity isn't just sort of the casual, I'd love to learn something. It's more in tune with how to help my business, my company, navigate very choppy and unpredictable waters. And so that sort of opening of signal detection is a critical skill that the really talented leaders nurture over time. You don't necessarily come to it naturally. You have to work your way into it, but it is also, we also know its absence when leaders don't pay attention to what's going on. They just drill down into a specific aspect of their own business, hoping that nobody notices them or that they don't have any impact from outside forces. And of course, outside forces come in, competitors, regulatory changes, you name it. And those things can actually have a dramatic impact if you don't have some level of signal detection. Within that, there is then a series of different things that we looked at that came out powerfully in the research. And because the idea of sustainability in a business is an enormous topic, it's not unlike that concept of boil the ocean. It's big, and it's really hard to do. So I wanted to make it basically accessible, digestible, so that you could look at it in different smaller pieces and say, how can we tackle each piece in order to be more effective as an organization? And I broke it down into 3 key themes. One is about value meaning. How do we as an organization define what we stand for? Because that's really important. And by the way, if an organization says, well, we stand for making money, I would argue that's a very weak meaning proposition. Every organization wants to make money. They want to sustain themselves. They want to have financial health so they can continue to prosper. But its meaning gets much deeper than that. What is our reason to exist in the first place? The second piece to that is value measure, and that is, what are the basic areas that will determine that we are on track or off track with what we're intending to do. And the third piece is value mobilization. And that are really the actions and activities that are undertaken by the organization as they make progress toward those objectives. And so those three areas then are broken down further within the book into different areas that help an organization say, okay, where do we start? How do we do this? How do we define the next steps for us? And it's designed to be a template to help them work through most effectively how to do that. And again, it came from the conversations with leaders and things I've taught over the last 20 years.
And a lot of times it's about helping businesses, which you just touched on a little bit earlier on, around purpose leadership. Leadership for purpose, because a lot of times when you even start with the notion of purpose, it sounds, for lack of a better term, airy-fairy. It's very abstract. It's not necessarily concrete. It's not for profit and the like. And we almost remove, as soon as we partnered purpose, we almost feel as though purpose, once we put the word purpose in, profit goes out of the window. And that doesn't have to be the case, does it? So how then do we start shifting and become more intentional about purpose leadership?
Yeah, and you're right. It's gotten a bad name at times, and it's partly because people do see it as airy-fairy, as you mentioned. And purpose, yet, is also an animating force to help galvanize people inside an organization around the work that they do as serving a larger cause, right? When you define purpose clearly and carefully, they don't feel like they're just a hired hand in an organization, but they feel like they're actually contributing in a meaningful way to work. Now, that sounds really ethereal, but you know it in organizations where it's lacking, where it's really sort of a hard driving organization focused on making next day's numbers, absent any long-term benefit to society or to even the health of the organization. When it's missing, people begin to feel like they're working in a toxic environment. So purpose has resonance with employees in particular, but it also serves a larger purpose in providing a strategic guide for companies, in that you want to aim for something that is not quite achievable tomorrow, a bit like the star in deep in space, the North Star, the guiding star. You may never get specifically to that star, but it gives you a sort of a compass heading about how to get towards a destination that improves what you're doing. Purpose helps give that galvanizing sense. And think of it in the context of sports. You know, when athletes are competing in teams against another team, you know, they're not only thinking about the tactics in the moment, they're also thinking about, well, what's it going to be for us if we do well over the context of a season and so on. And that purpose of sort of being able to be effective over time and improve along the way, given different conditions, enables them to navigate toward hopefully a better outcome down the road. Again, everything is unpredictable, but the absence of it, not knowing what your intended direction is, means you could go anywhere and you probably won't go anywhere. You know, that's the challenge behind purpose.
That is very good. I'm going to take in a couple of questions as well, John. So just bear with us. We've got Nicola Tyler saying, hi, everybody. How do companies budget for sustainability? What do they need to do to get the attention of leaders and executives and shareholders? We get what we measure. So how do we get companies, or how do companies budget for sustainability?
It's a great question. We would probably take the next couple of days to answer the question in detail, but let me frame it this way. There is increasing movement around the world in different markets, the EU, here in the US, and so on, about stronger disclosure requirements. And that's important because the disclosure requirements about a company's carbon footprint and environmental emissions, if you will, has a demonstrable impact on ultimately how shareholders would see the risk proposition of that organization and its health over the long term. So as those regulatory markets strengthen, it gives an incentive to companies to want to produce and disclose those factors. Now, that is evolving, and there are a lot of different standards worldwide. But each of the different standards are a way for organizations to say, let's find the different sustainability aspects in our company, whether it's scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 emissions that we can tackle that would help not only improve our footprint and reduce our impact in the world, but also create a pathway toward, in effect, a triple bottom line where it's not just economic, but it's social benefit and it's environmental benefit. And those factors are outlined in a wide range of different standards and certifications out there, whether it's SASB or GRI standards. I mean, I could throw out the acronyms, but they're out there right now that organizations worldwide are wrestling with. And those standards become an important benchmark for how companies can then say, okay, now how do we translate that into our business itself? Now, here's where we are in this marketplace worldwide, is so much of the reporting that currently occurs is mostly self-reporting. It is not necessarily mandated yet. We're getting closer to that. And when it's self-reporting, you still have to depend on the veracity, the trust, the ability of the organization to demonstrate that the data it's using to report its sustainability imperatives is accurate. And that's still evolving. But the good news is it's evolving really fast. And those data sources are now becoming increasingly standard worldwide. And when you look at CDP, which is another organization that has fantastic data on companies and their reporting, you're getting more and more of an accurate picture of how you can best translate that into your own organization. So that doesn't answer a specific company. What it does say is that, number one, regulatory markets are changing. Number two, the standards and the certifications that help us determine what is an effective approach to measuring these things is rapidly evolving in a good way so it becomes more demonstrable. And number three, there's a real shareholder interest out there now in whether or not a company is actually putting down a firm line in the sand that says this is something we actually stand for, not just to return benefit to our shareholders this quarter, but over time, because we want to be around for 50 years, 100 years, not just 50 days or 100 days in order to enhance a particular shareholder class. We actually want to benefit all stakeholders. And that's increasingly where you're seeing this momentum. And that's making it easier and easier to measure. It's not to say it is easy. It is to say it's getting easier.
I like the clarification there. I'm going to move on to another question as well, John, coming in from Emmanuel. I was saying, looking at the triple bottom line as a basis for sustainability, how do you get leaders to have a balance of financial, social, and environmental consequences of their actions? Is there a blueprint for this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the original, and his name escapes me, but the person who originally conceived of the idea of the triple bottom line actually wrote an article in Harvard Business Review in the last few years in which he regretted having said what he said because it got misused. And the reason for that is that the triple bottom line was intended to be a larger sort of economic meta look at how to ensure that a business's impact is larger than what it has become, which is much more of a focus internally on small incremental changes in a company. Now, I mention it because the triple bottom line actually is a byproduct of well, I shouldn't say byproduct, but is an important ingredient for helping organizations gain literacy and fluency in sustainability related topics. Now, let me just pause it for a moment and say what that really comes down to and what the obligation is on companies. We are not at a point right now where senior leadership and boards of directors in companies around the world are universally familiar with all the different sustainability nomenclature, the acronyms, the things I even tossed out earlier in my answer. We have peripheral understanding. We have a broad-based sort of recognition that sustainability is important, that there is environmental degradation and so on. But at the business level, boards and senior leadership in far too many companies are still lacking fluency and literacy in this space. So I think the first step here is building that capability. And that means bringing those leaders into situations like what SBI offers, like what we do at the University of Oregon and plenty of other institutions where they can gain that familiarity, because if nothing else, the vocabulary does matter. And if you say things like scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, or greenhouse gas, GHG inventories or whatever, it actually has meaning to people as opposed to a series of sort of ill-defined concepts. That literacy is really important because that makes it easier to have those conversations inside companies. And that That is happening as well, but it's happening in fits and starts. So we need to see boards and we need to see senior management have that familiarity and that comfort with sustainability in order to enact and exact bigger changes inside the organizations.
Yeah. Just, around organizational buy-in, because I truly believe the background of any organization are the people that work within the organization. You are nothing without your human capital. In fact, the business fails without the people. And in that, the people need to be able to buy into the value of the business. As you're speaking here about budgeting for sustainability, budgeting and looking at the blueprint, for example, of being able to manage some of these consequences and thought pieces. But not everybody is going to buy in, or the work of buying in to the organizational culture, the values, the purpose of the organization is a lot of work. It takes a certain kind of leadership to get people to buy into the vision or to buy into the value. How then do you start getting it in a practical way? How then do you start fostering that buy-in so that from the C-suite level, from the chairman of the board, right down to the person that makes coffee in the morning, there is a seamless buy-in and there's an integrated buy-in, a coherent buy-in of the organizational values and trust and the ethos, so that you're not afraid of what the chairman is going to say, and you're not afraid of what the person that makes coffee or even the cleaner is going to say about the organization. How do you foster in a practical way that buy-in?
Yeah, so it kind of comes back to what we mentioned earlier, which is this idea that we need that literacy and understanding, so that those who are promoting the buy-in or trying to encourage buy-in can explain what these things mean to them. But that's one point. The other piece to that, and it comes back to what we talked about with respect to purpose, or I call it aspiration. How do you link an organization's ultimate sort of, this is what we stand for in the world, to the meaning of the work for the people within? And that's a key piece. Then that's ongoing conversations, town hall meetings, regular communication, just like we do with anything else in business. It needs to become a regular part of the social fabric of an organization. But Faith, the other piece to this too that was fascinating in the research is I looked at what I basically termed as the behaviors of top performers in organizations. And I distilled it down to 5 key behaviors and practices that they undertake. And specifically to your point on business and people, one of the behaviors that I call the relationship ambassador comes down to what it sounds like. You have to be really comfortable with and willing to stick your neck out, work with others, influence others, get comfortable with people as people, because at the end of the day, if our teams, if our colleagues, if our coworkers aren't on board and we're not singing from sort of the same book, it's going to be really difficult. That doesn't mean there's going to be perfect uniformity, but it does mean we have to have a capacity for human understanding. But let me frame it a different way. So one of the CEOs I spoke to about 4 years ago in the research said to me quite candidly, and I won't name who the person is, but said, my work as a CEO is driven around shareholder enrichment, and my work is a lot easier when I'm dealing with spreadsheets. The thing that complicates it are people. Now, that was one of those, wait a second, did you just say that the people in your organization are sort of secondary to an Excel spreadsheet? And so that was one of the outliers in the research that made me realize, there are enough people who've realized that the inconvenience of all of us and the unpredictability of the human factor is a really tough management and leadership challenge that some of them feel and face. It's, by the way, it's not to be, we shouldn't be sympathetic toward them, because I think it's a real disaster when you have leaders who don't understand the human dimension of business and focus only on managing spreadsheets and whatnot. But it was a real lesson in recognizing that we matter. Our role matters. Our influence, the way we can work with others, actually matters. And so that relationship ambassador component of those 5 different behaviors was an important revelation. And it's funny too when you think about how we work with each other. When I got out of graduate school 500 years ago, I came into business with all these frameworks, and I was ready to go and ready to apply those frameworks. And it very quickly became apparent that over the course of my career since then, the application of some of the more rigid frameworks is really secondary to the capacity to work well with others, to collaborate, to sit back, to listen, to, in effect, be a decent person. because at the end of the day, colleagues want to work with people they enjoy. And if you're kind of a jerk or whatever, the likelihood you're going to enjoy that is really small.
Very true. I've got another question coming in from Nadira Karim saying, what does an organization stand for? This is a really useful measurement for business and leaders, quite aptly related to purpose and success. If we look at people driving the strategy and executing on it, what does an organization stand for? This is a very useful measurement. I think let's talk a little bit about that and expound further on that one, because what an organization stands for is also going to determine the depth and the width of transformation, especially in the global crisis that you speak of there. John.
Sure. So what you stand for is really what I term your aspiration. Why are we here in the first place? And that is actually an important internal recognition all of us, whether we're individuals or a company, really sort of need to wrestle with. We actually shouldn't have to wrestle with. It should be sort of common sense, but it often isn't. But defining what that is will vary by organization. That idea of what we stand for is going to vary from if you're in the pharmaceutical sector versus consumer products versus services or whatever it might be. But being clear on that is paramount to having an organization where people rally around a common sense of cause and ingredients. But it also comes into then how you define the ways you're going to determine your success in that area. So part of it, there are four dimensions of value that I look at in there. One is reputation value. So once you've sort of as an organization agreed, this is what we are here for, this is our distinctive capability, this is what we bring to the planet, we need to look at our reputation value. In other words, are we trusted? Are we honoring the words and the promises that we make? The second piece to it is organizational value. And organizational value is are the people inside, do they feel like their work actually matters, that they're contributing to a greater good? The third piece is external, and that's societal value. And that is, are we then doing right by society? Are we engaged in the communities we serve? And the final piece is financial value. And that is based on doing those other three things well, the byproduct is financial value. We often flip that, particularly in business schools. We often teach the outcome of a business is to focus on financial value. But that's actually a byproduct of doing these other things well. You can have financial value doing anything, selling pencils on the street, but the reality of it is if you want to have an organization that has that sort of sense of purpose and aspiration, that's going to drive a much different and better and richer long-term value creation solution for the company. But the other piece of that too, Faith, and to get deeper into the question is, we've operated for decades now in the profit motive, and for a company to actually to have a real true sense of its purpose and its aspiration, we need to shift towards what I call the societal value motive, which is you still have to focus on how you're going to, in fact, make money, but it then becomes a question of how you distribute and allocate the proceeds from your prosperity. And it isn't just a shareholder question, it becomes a stakeholder question. And that's where this whole conversation that everybody's hearing about around stakeholder capitalism is increasingly important. It's not increasingly, it's critical, because it isn't just about our shareholders, it's about our employees, our customers, our supply chain, value chain members, and so on. And that larger impact is ultimately what businesses have to think about. And that's complex. But you know what? We can solve it. We've solved big, challenging things before. This is the latest.
Very true. But also when we're taking a look at LeaderSHIFT, right, it requires a shift, so as it were. Now, there's this term called, if it's not broke, don't fix it, or don't fix it if it's not broke, right? However, business works a little bit differently. So how frequently should businesses shift or evolve with the current needs of the time? Because depending on how big an organization is, you'll find that some organizations truly believe that in about 20 years, we've been doing this for the past 100 years, we're going to keep doing this because it's been working for the past 100 years. And the markets are changing, as you're referring to it. The markets are changing, the people are changing, the needs are changing, the societal climate is changing. But how soon and how frequently should we actually evolve? Is it every 5 years? Is it every 10 years? Is it when it's broken? What's the medium kind of balance there?
I love this because what it implies is that there's a cadence to revisiting this, and there's a magic number. And the answer is there isn't a magic number. The real solution here is not unlike what used to be considered performance reviews, which were done annually for an individual, which has been proven time and again to be sort of ineffective. And the better solution is to have ongoing conversations. And the same thing is true here. Organizational change and transformation isn't something you look at and say, let's do it again in 5 years. It is more around how adaptable are we to the dynamics of the marketplace around us. And that comes back to, I'm going to take it back to what I mentioned earlier about leaders having this signal detection capability. The more, and a leader doesn't have to just be the CEO, by the way. It can be you and me on a team buried deep in the organization, and you're leading a small team or a project. Your capacity to see those larger signals will help determine your ability to adjust. And that ability to adjust is part of the dynamic of shifting. Years ago, I gave a talk to an organization that was literally wrestling with they hadn't changed anything structurally in 17 years. And they were really, it was a huge psychological, cultural change for them. And the short answer to that is it's too bad they missed like 17 years of opportunities to be more reflective on how to be responsive to what's going on in the world around them, versus organizations that are kind of perpetually tinkering around the edges all the time, moving teams into different locations, getting leaders to take on different assignments and so on. And so it's perpetual, Faith. It's perpetual.
As we close up, it's quite scary. As I look at the time, we've got about 2 minutes or so left before we have to say goodbye. I mean, where's the time gone? But how do we start advising leaders, particularly in this? And sometimes it is a crisis point. It is, we are in a global crisis. We're trying to figure things out. We're trying to match a trajectory. We're trying to be more humanistic in our approach, but also keeping in mind that we've got shareholders that we have to account to. What advice and takeaways can you really give our delegates this afternoon, or depending where they are joining us from the world, that they can walk away with to implement starting today? What can I do? What's that little change I can do so that I can change the outcome of my business, especially where sustainability is concerned?
Yeah, so the number one thing I would say across the board, and this is pretty simple, you've got to maintain some level of hope and optimism. And the reason for that is you lead by example. And so everything you do in an organization spills out to how others interpret your actions. And if your sort of worldview is either A, we need to ignore the changes around us, or B, it's not going to affect us, or C, it's doom and gloom, and then you're going to have an organization that is going to be dysfunctional and eventually toxic. So how you lead matters, how you show up. And I think that really comes down to this notion of you've got to be able to demonstrate for people. This has always been true with leaders. The best leaders give people a sense of cause and purpose and hope that things can get better if they work together toward that. That to me is absolutely critical.
Yeah, it certainly is. It gives us a lot to think about. And as I said, I mean, this is some real high level fireside conversations. And more than anything else, it requires us to really start taking a look at how we view ourselves, how we view others. But I love what you were saying earlier on around value, and the value proposition of an organization, because that becomes very integral. So any parting shots? I mean, where are you off to after this? I mean, you feel like a man of adventure. So besides the wine in Italy, where are we going after this?
Yeah, so you're right. Italy coming up, and then I'm in London and Paris in the early part of the fall. I'll actually get to Singapore in the middle part of the fall, and then just teaching regularly at the University of Oregon to my incredible students. I'm really lucky, Faith. I've got fantastic colleagues and students. I really mean that. I love what I do. So wherever I end up going, I end up enjoying it.
I think it's a lesson that we can all learn for this afternoon, is the fact that if you don't love what you're doing, it's going to feel like work. But if you love what you're doing, it really just feels like purpose, really purpose that gives you profit at the end of the day. Exactly. And much appreciated, Don. It's an absolute honor and it's an absolute privilege to have heard from you this afternoon. It's beautiful to be able to expound on how we can start putting together those puzzle pieces so that indeed our businesses can become more sustainable. And if we need to evolve, if we need to shift as leaders, we're then able to implement those kinds of shifts that are needed within the organization, so that in 15, 20, 50, 100 years time, we can still be as relevant today as we are then. So much appreciated for your time. And delegates, it's about 16:46 on my watch, South African time, which means that we have come to the end of our conversation for this series. Thank you so much to John Davis for joining us this afternoon. Much appreciated. Do not, stay away from the dial. Please keep your emails on, because we're going to be sending you more information about the next series, which is going to be happening on the 20th of July. We're going to be joined by Harvard fellow Ann Pratt, who will be joining us from the United States, who is the founder of Leading Boldly into the Future, as well as a Mandela Leadership Blueprint. So we really are in for quite a treat on the 20th of July. Please diarize that day so that indeed we are able to participate as a collective. But until you and I talk again, until we meet again, until we shift again, please have a leadership in your space. And until we talk again, goodbye, everyone.